Nem leszünk utolsók a svéd NATO-csatlakozás ratifikációjával. Mondta a magyar kormány több mint egy évig, majd utolsók lettünk. Erdogán aláírásával Törökország is jóváhagyta Svédország tagságát. Orbán Viktor, illetve a Fidesz viszont továbbra is kéreti magát. És tárgyalásra hívta a svéd miniszterelnököt Budapestre. A mai, angol nyelvű adásban annak járok utána, hogyan fest a történet svéd szemszögből. És milyen hatással van az időhúzás Magyarország nemzetközi helyzetére. Telefonon csatlakozik hozzám Ingmar Nevéus, a svéd Dagens Nyheter külpolitikai újságírója, korábbi orosz és ukrán, jelenlegi európai tudósító. Én Nagy Iván László vagyok, ez pedig a Fülke, a HVG közéleti podcastja. Ingmar, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to come on the show. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Could you talk us through the last week in Sweden? What was the reception of Turkey's green light to the accession and Hungary's reluctance to do accordingly?
Well, of course, it was huge news. I mean, the NATO issue has been dominant ever since the war in Ukraine started, really, and public opinion shifted very quickly from 30% being, wanting to become a member of NATO, and it's more than doubled to 65%. So, of course, the story of Turkey's and also Hungary's reluctance to let us in has been huge. I mean, I just checked our archive and we've been writing about this every single week, different aspects of it, mainly Turkey, but then Hungary has, sailed up also. So, of course, the fact that the Turkish parliament finally said yes, it was breaking news. It was very big story, and last Tuesday, and then of course we turned our attention to Hungary, the country that had promised not to be the last one to ratify Sweden, but turned out to be the last one.
But just to clarify, is this still an everyday issue in Sweden? Because I remember last year, around this time, I was talking to a Finnish colleague on the podcast, and for obvious reasons, they were saying that, well, because of the border, this is very much a burning question in the everyday conversation in the media. Is this the case as well in Sweden, or has it kind of gotten to an important, but not like a daily level important thing to cover?
Well, I think it's still almost a daily, and certainly right now it's a daily issue. But this is maybe thanks to, the resistance we've encountered from these two countries. I mean, if it hadn't been for Turkey and also Hungary, it would have been solved a long time ago, like in Finland's case. So that has added drama for the media, and it's been in politics, it's been the central thing for the government to handle, and everybody's been very critical of the way our government has handled this issue also. So yeah, I think it's more than the actual, becoming a member of NATO, because there is such a big majority for that. It's the issue in the center of things has been, how are we handling this with these two reluctant countries?
Just as a side note, is there still unwavering support in Sweden for Ukraine? Because what we're seeing in the rest of the western part of the continent is that there are kind of a little cracks appearing on this alliance next to Ukraine. What is the situation in Sweden?
I think I haven't checked the latest numbers, but Sweden has been, if you're talking about public opinion, we've been the top 3 countries all around the world, in supporting Ukraine. So maybe that has sunk a little bit, but I think it's a given that people here are very much supporting Ukraine for various reasons, historic reasons or whatever. I don't think we're in the wavering camp. Not politically and not as far as public opinion. I mean, I can't predict the future. It could be. We also don't have very many Ukrainian refugees here compared to some other countries. So that is not such a big, the refugee fatigue is not a big issue here either.
Right. Thank you. Let's get back to the question of Hungary. Just as Turkey announced that it's giving a green light to Sweden, Viktor Orbán has invited Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson to visit Budapest. Do you expect the Prime Minister to accept this invitation? And could you explain why he was hesitant to do so?
I think we've all read these letters back and forth from, first a letter from Orbán to Kristersson and then his response where he said that, yes, it would be a good idea to meet. But I think both of those letters were very carefully worded. And in fact, both of them, in my opinion, were more for internal consumption in the respective countries. Like everybody or most people here noted that Orbán's letter, in fact, did not mention the word negotiations, although he said that in other, on Twitter, etc. Also, Kristersson's response was like, on the surface, yes, let's meet in Budapest, but it could be also interpreted like, let's meet in Budapest when everything is, over with, when you have accepted Sweden. And he also added that, we'll have an opportunity to meet, which is this week's summit, EU summit in Brussels. So in fact, these so-called negotiations, from our point of view, and also I think the government, there is nothing really to negotiate about to give Hungary, in return for accepting Sweden.
So just time wasting.
Well, maybe. I mean, there's always this game going on, and a lot of times it's about looking strong for, one's own people, in the eyes of one's own people. So, you know more about Hungary, obviously, but for Sweden, I think Ulf Kristersson was kind of burned. His experience with Erdogan and Ankara, his visit to Ankara in August 22 was a very bad experience. He was, the general opinion here was that he was humiliated.
But could you explain why? Why is this sense?
A lot of people, commentators and other politicians here thought that there was a summit, a NATO summit in Madrid in the summer of 22, and where there was some kind of agreement with Sweden, Turkey, and also Finland. And that Kristersson should have, that should have been enough, that he didn't have to come crawling to Ankara, begging Erdogan to, accept us. And because the only thing that visit, the result was that Erdogan came up with even more demands on Sweden, which made the whole issue more complicated. And I think for Kristersson to go today to Budapest would probably be just an Orbán show, for his own public. And he would in some ways, try to humiliate Kristersson just by arriving would be a humiliation in some sense.
Obviously, in the case of Turkey and Sweden, there were actually things to discuss, unlike in the case of Hungary and Sweden. Would you mind just briefly explaining what was the issue between the two countries, just for our listeners?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Turkey had very specific demands on Sweden related to terrorism. They were stating that Sweden harbors PKK terrorists. PKK, both EU and the US consider terrorist organization, Kurdish organization, but they also had a much wider definition of terrorism than we do, also including the Syrian Kurdish organizations that Sweden had, that were allies to the US in against ISIS and so forth. Also the Gülenist movement that staged the coup against Erdogan, which we don't consider terrorists. There are some sympathizers of all these organizations living in Sweden. And Turkey even had a list of people they wanted extradited. There was also the issue of exporting arms to Turkey, which Sweden hasn't done. And on this point, the government changed their mind in Madrid and said, okay, we will do it. Although there are no incoming orders from Turkey, but more the principle. And also we have even discussed changing our constitution when it comes to terrorism and, extraditing people and so forth. So many people here, political parties and commentators, think that we have paid way too much to Turkey.
Has this affected the Prime Minister's position? Has his numbers dropped because of this?
His numbers have certainly dropped very much. And this is one factor that they are perceived as weak in the one crucial foreign issue that they have had to handle. But there are also many other reasons. We have the far-right Sweden Democrats that supports the government, but are not in the government, and they are the public thinks that they have too much power, in fact. But this is not really connected to the NATO issue.
So with Erdogan out of the picture, how would you explain Hungary's decision to continue to stall on Sweden's accession?
I think Viktor Orbán has this window of opportunity. He has veto power in NATO, as he also has in the EU. And obviously, this veto power is his, claim to fame. As soon as he lets go of it, the issue right now with the 50 billion euro to Ukraine, the moment he lets go of that veto, then he's just, he sinks into the background again, and he loses this position that he has when he can at least seem to dictate politics outside of Hungary. So the NATO issue is like that. He can look really tough in front of his own voters and also seem as a brave person who dares to criticize, not only the Swedes, but also Washington, Brussels. Makes, in his mind, maybe that makes him look strong. He has to savor this moment, for a little while more.
Right, but at the same time, the EU and NATO really must come up with a solution because being blackmailed by a country of 10 million people is really not a position that you want to be in amidst a plethora of crises in the world. What do you believe is the more, let's say, rational strategy for these organizations to deal with Orbán? Do you think there is a point in appeasement which has been tried to be done for a long while now? Or is there actually basis for forceful action to take to kind of cut down the arms of the Orbán octopus to make him less powerful and have less of a grip on decision making?
Well, I'm not the politician, but certainly the opinion among top politicians, both in Sweden and Europe, I think is shifting towards the hardline approach. And, appeasement, obviously, I think a lot of people think that appeasement hasn't worked. And I think you probably noticed the article in the Financial Times this weekend saying that in the European Council, there are voices that want to sabotage Hungary's economy, which has already led the forint to plunge. So I think some people are of the opinion that Orbán, behind all the ideological noises, he's quite a transactional politician that, and that money talks, and other countries in the EU and possibly also NATO are thinking of ways to threaten him economically and get him in line. And also, the interview with the American ambassador in Budapest, very, very hard criticisms, which surprisingly hard, I would say, for a diplomat against his own host country. Also, Antony Blinken, the American foreign minister yesterday, I think, was very tough against Hungary. So I think a lot of countries are trying to up the ante here and be tougher.
This might be a theoretical question, but do you think that the EU and NATO have the credentials to step up actually forcefully within their realms against someone? Does this not go against its core principles of finding consensus and finding ways forward together with complete unity? Does this not discredit the EU and NATO if they take such measures within their borders? But it also plays into the hands of Orbán. This is what he wants to be able to portray in Hungary, that here's this empire striking down on us. So it's this kind of, there's no good option for the EU or the NATO, as it seems.
Well, maybe you're right. It certainly is a dilemma, when a member of a club doesn't, agree to certain rules of the game. I mean, from the EU's or NATO's perspective, it's Hungary that's breaking the rules. I mean, Hungary took part in the decision in NATO that doors should be open. They have signed, the Lisbon Protocol in the EU, that, means you should adhere to European values, etc. So, I mean, other countries have tried different ways, but I think certainly the open or more or less, or the leaked proposals to hurt Hungary economically, it could certainly play into Orbán's hands, absolutely. But at the end of the day, Hungary needs to ask itself, or Orbán, do we really want to be a member of these organizations that we are constantly criticizing? If they're so bad, why should we even be members? But I don't know if that's come up in the Hungarian debate.
What has really struck me in our conversation right now is that you have not mentioned Russian influence as a factor in Orbán's behavior. And it's really interesting because you yourself have been a Russian correspondent. Do you believe there is actually a strong tie between Budapest and the Kremlin, and there is this kind of shared interest that they're dealing over? Or is Orbán really just in his mind of real politics where he goes where the money is and just decides what's best for Fidesz's internal campaign? Do you think there's actually such a strong connection? Because you haven't mentioned it, and it's striking because when you talk to foreign journalists, it's almost the first thing that comes up. Yeah,
well, he certainly acts in a way that Putin would approve of 100%. I mean, the common denominator between denying Ukraine money and denying Sweden, a place in NATO is that Putin would want those two things. As far as direct links or taking orders from Putin, I have no idea, but Hungary is certainly more dependent on Russia economically with the nuclear power, with exceptions as far as other Russian energy and so forth. Also ideologically, Orbán is very, with family values, all the illiberal thinking is, of course, much closer to Putin's Russia than to the majority of EU countries. So, but whether or not it's directly, connected, I don't know. I don't know really.
How would you define Hungary's weight and role in global politics? Is this only a question that we have to discuss because of Orbán's actions, or in a normal circumstance, in a more democratic circumstance, would there be an actual important position for a country between the East and the West?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think you, as Hungarians, know more about this, but, historically, and I talked to a Hungarian diplomat recently. He mentioned the fact that for Hungary, at being a small country, different ethnically or linguistically from all its neighbors, it's important to be that kind of bridge. And it's important what happens in, he said, 3 capitals, which would be Berlin, Moscow, and Istanbul or Ankara. and that you have to constantly, juggle these three regional big powers and kind of be friends with all of them. If you think that way, maybe even a liberal or a new Hungarian government someday that is more in line with the Western thinking would still, irritate its allies by being that East-West bridge. And maybe it's natural and it's a question of survival for the nation. I don't know. And it has to be respected. But at this moment, to give Moscow's thinking a big role as a NATO and EU member, it's certainly something that most allies don't like at all.
Right. So how do you see the coming weeks or months playing out for the case of Sweden's accession to NATO? Do you believe that, as the head of NATO predicted, accession is going to go through by July?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, it would be very remarkable if the Hungarian parliament didn't say yes in the last week of February. But I don't know if you have any other signals, but everybody knows that it's Orbán's decision. But I mean, he himself is saying, at least to Sweden, that, he's for our membership. So what could be, the problems here? It would be interesting to see this week, this Thursday, whether the two prime ministers actually, meet bilaterally during the summit in Brussels. There are different levels they could do it. They could schedule it, or they could just, run into each other and talk. And this could be, something could come out of that. But, if Hungary continues to stall after February 26th, well, then they would really have to, they would have the whole of NATO against them, and the US are also mentioned in the Swedish debate, at least, is that we do have some pressure points also in the Gripen aircraft, also the strategic airlift capability, which is headquartered or they have all their airplanes in Hungary, as far as I know. And some people have suggested here that, we should use this as leverage, because Hungary, I think, have to renew their lease on the Gripen aircrafts. And, it's also, the Gripen are also mentioned in Kristersson's letter to Orbán. And you could interpret that as a kind of a threat. So, we'll see. But as far as I know, we will become members within, a pretty short time.
Ingmar, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Hallgatóinak pedig köszönöm a figyelmet. A Fülke hamarosan folytatódik, de ami legalább ilyen fontos, hogy elindultak a HVG podcastok tavaszi évadjai. 7 különböző műsorral készültünk, vannak régi ismerősök és 2 teljesen új podcast is. Iratkozzanak fel a HVG podcastokra és kapcsolják be az értesítéseket, hogy egyetlen adásunkról sem maradjanak le. Én Nagy Iván László vagyok, viszonthallásra.